button, and I think we're recording. So hopefully, I'm not sure where that'll end up, but it'll end up somewhere. And once I figure that out, we'll move forward. So the idea behind this is a lecture I gave a few years ago at one of our Grand Rounds talks, talking about supplements in sport. And if people have questions along the way, feel free to just pipe up. But the idea is to provide people with a little bit of a framework of what's out there, what's being used, kind of getting the understanding of the environment around where supplements are, they're part of all of our athletes' lives. My general feeling about supplements and performance enhancing substances is it's better to be aware so you can actually have a discussion with your patients about supplements. And so I think it's important to have an understanding of the language, have some basic understanding of the basic science, and then ultimately review the data on your own and come to conclusions based off of the data as to what you would recommend or not, pro or con or otherwise. So let's see here. There we go. So I don't have any disclaimers. So what is a dietary supplement? Well, the Dietary Supplement Health and Education Act back in 1994 defined a supplement as something that is intended to supplement a diet, typically includes multiple dietary ingredients. That might be minerals, herbs, and botanicals, which are a subset of dietary supplements, the herbal supplement regimen. But it's sort of a broad spanning definition, typically intended to be taken by mouth, at least in the way that it's described, and is actually labeled as a dietary supplement. And so the FDA has rules and regulations around supplements we'll talk a little bit about, but there are certain labeling indications that are implied when somebody is selling a supplement, and certain regulations around what claims can be made about those supplements. So we'll talk a little bit about that. Specifically, herbal supplements are typically also known as botanicals, made from plants, algae, some biologic source in nature, and maybe sold as a variety of different forms, everything from teas to capsules and tablets. So a variety of different things. So think about herbal supplements as a subset of dietary supplements. So I talked a little bit about the FDA. So supplements are regulated through the FDA. I think there's a sense of question as to what the level of regulation is. The regulation is a little different than for prescribed substances or something that is considered medication that we can prescribe from a pharmacy or over-the-counter medications. So it's different regulation than OTCs or prescriptions. Manufacturers actually don't have to prove safety or efficacy prior to marketing. And, if you think to all of the issues around athletes taking quote unquote tainted supplements, one of the challenges is to sort of regulate, but how effectively is that regulation in evaluating safety, efficacy, and sort of other issues that might be tied to a company that might be trying to sell and promote their product for a certain use, and trying to find ways to make that drug effective in some ways. And I do think of supplements as drugs. When I talk to patients, I say this is just one other thing that might work through your, through your cytochrome P450 system or all the other processes. So you want to be careful about any supplements and how they may interact with a person's prescribed medications, as well as what impacts they may have on their health and performance. So
here's what I found.
There goes Siri. All right, and so regulation. So talked a little bit about this, but a manufacturer is permitted to promote a product's effect in supporting health, nutritional deficiencies, or particularly body functions, if there's some research available to support that claim. So there's a lot of quote unquote research out there. And if you go onto a lot of these steroid and performance enhancing forums, there's a lot of talk of what research is being done, oftentimes obviously done by the companies themselves and have a lot of biases involved. But they have to put a qualifier on there that a statement of nutritional support has not been evaluated by the US FDA, and it's not actually intended to treat or diagnose any particular disease. And so you can see how there's this sort of dance that's being done between people who are producing supplements trying to make claims that are not strong enough to reach the attention of the FDA. And so it's a challenge to kind of find that balance, and obviously a challenge for our patients who may not have really a clear understanding of how to manage all of that. And so Regulation, manufacturers are expected to follow good manufacturing processes and practices. And if the FDA comes to some knowledge that there's a problem with their manufacturing processes, either through some report or bad outcomes from patients, they may be able to go in and evaluate or pull the product from market. So just know that FDA has some leverage there. But I do think that as a result, this really creates a culture of buyer beware. There's medications like Airborne that were popular, and you even still have some popularity that is sort of a mix of vitamins and vitamin C that are sort of labeled broadly as a medication, or not a medication, as a supplement to help support immune health during infection, to help you get over your cold faster. And then there's a lot of supplements that are targeted towards performance enhancement. So you got to be a little bit careful about what's in those supplements, particularly as a collegiate or pro athlete, or if you're a physician taking care of a collegiate pro athlete who's having testing done periodically to determine whether they may be using substances that are banned. So just be wary of these. Claims of efficacy may not always be credible because they're obviously trying to sell a product. And obviously, because there's less regulation about how these substances and supplements are made, there's variable quality of the supply. So you may not be getting the same stuff every time you take the pill. So just be careful about that. So why do we take these products? So, I think my general feeling, at least in the US, is that people are often looking for a quick out, a quick fix. In Seattle, a lot of these products are taken because people have a wariness against standard medications and more traditional treatments. And so part of my evolution as a physician living in this culture was to become more and more aware of some of these products, just because my patients are all taking them and they feel that if I have knowledge about them, that validates me more and it allows me to talk about the treatments that I'm more interested in alongside the supplements they may be using. And so just having that awareness is important, but they're often looking for faster results or alternative results, like inflammation, whatever that is sort of a popular term, at least in my clinic. And people say, well, I'm trying to get rid of my inflammation. And what that actually means is debatable. There's athlete role modeling. So you see that picture of I think it's Tony Horton from P90X. As you can tell, I made this talk a few years ago. So, but anyways, P90X was a big thing, about 7-8 years ago. And he and many athletes that have come since him and prior have put their name or affixed their name to supplements to help sell certain products, claiming that that was the product that pushed them to the top of the ladder for what they do. So a lot of the marketing as well for supplements now is tied to certain types of products, like P90X has its own line of supplements. EAS was a very famous supplement manufacturer, and they have a number of different products out there as well. And I think ultimately most people would love a result like this, the promise of a better person here. So can you be more fit? So what about use? So the most recent survey that looked at this, there's a US CDC National Health Survey where they basically survey individuals of all different ages in a subset to try to gauge different behaviors. That might be sexual behaviors, that may be performance enhancing drugs, that might be illicit substances. They have this broad survey that they distribute to a segment of the population and collect that data and analyze it. And the 2012 survey found that via that methodology, about 18% of adults and about 5% of children in the prior 12 months had used a supplement consistently. There's separate studies that actually show that in different populations, you may see as much as 52% use, including if you include things like multivitamins. My sense, and if you look at even more specialized studies around, workout facilities, gyms, clubs, like CrossFit gyms, and you might see almost 100% supplement use in some of those communities. So just beware of who you're taking care of and what they may be taking as a result of their association or affiliation with different sort of communities. So one of the challenges is that most supplements contain dozens of active compounds, whereas most of our prescribed substances have a handful of compounds that are included and one or two that might be biologically active, oftentimes just one. Many supplements contain dozens of active compounds, and the labeling that is on the bottle may not actually reflect what's actually going on in the actual pill, like what's actually included. So what about the most used natural products? So just going quickly to supplements that are used, or biologics in this case. Most commonly used supplements right now: fish oil. And I'm certainly guilty as charged because I could have a better HDL level. Glucosamine and chondroitin, I'm sure all of you have had questions about over the years in terms of how effective they are and in what populations. Probiotics are something that are commonly talked about, and melatonin is one of the supplements that's used commonly and actually has fairly strong data that it actually works quite well. CoQ10, echinacea, you can see those supplements, some with variable efficacy. There's a natural medicines database book. So for any of you who have interest in pursuing the data behind some of these substances, there's I forgot the name of the publishing company, but it's called the Natural Medicines Database. And it publishes a compendium of supplements and whatever evidence is out there in terms of peer-reviewed literature around some of these supplements. And for those of you who are interested, that might be a resource to invest in if you are in a community where there's a lot of this being utilized. So it's big business. In 2010, this was the last data I could dig up. I looked for an update yesterday, couldn't find too much, but supplements, my sense, have only increased in popularity over the years. But at least 28 billion is made per supplements in a given year. And you can see the distribution of how the majority of that comes from vitamins, but also a variety of other things like meal replacements. You can imagine how popular creatine has been and continues to be, herbals and botanicals. You can see it's big business here. So people stand to gain quite a bit of profit. So think of this as business just as much as it is marketing or medicine, and you will be better off in thinking about how to manage that. So what do we really know? And what I would say right off the bat is that the amount of scientific evidence behind some of these substances varies widely. As I mentioned, melatonin has demonstrable benefit, but most studies do not demonstrate that supplements as a whole provide evidence of supporting longevity, so reducing morbidity or mortality, improve cognitive support, or provide immunomodulatory support. And so whereas there's claims of, hey, we're going to allow you to live better and longer, we're going to improve your memory or your focus, or we're going to provide you with a better immune system, those have not been demonstrated. It's a broad category of things to think about. So there's a variety of different dietary supplements, as I mentioned, out there, and a couple studies just to be aware of. These are older studies, but one of the things that I talk about is that when you're taking these substances, you just kind of like Beaker over there, you may not really, you may have your head in the sand or in your collar, and you may just not realize what's in there. 2001 study back in the day by Green looked at a variety of different brands off the shelf from GNC, and 11 of those 12 substances contained variable amounts of their listed ingredients, and at least 5 of those 12, so almost about 40%, had at least one non-listed ingredient that was a primary ingredient in their constitution. And then 18.8% of 240 analyzed supplements in 2004 were found to contain steroids or prohormones. So you can imagine that if a company is trying to produce a supplement that has some efficacy, they may hide a steroid or thyroid hormone or growth hormone or other types of substances that are androgenic in their substance to promote outcomes. But that has obviously a lot of concerns regarding both safety, efficacy, fair play, a number of other things. But if somebody's saying, hey, I'm going to give you something that's going to cause you to gain muscle mass and lean up, be wary about what might actually be in that substance, especially when talking to athletes who might get tested later on and find that, hey, I tested positive for a steroid. You often hear about our athletes saying, I was given this supplement by a trainer, or I have no idea how this got into my system. In many instances, it's heavy supplement use that might factor in. So other added concerns, just so you're aware, as I mentioned, drug interactions, supplement to supplement interactions, whether these are shortcuts in terms of shortcuts to optimal nutrition or performance for people who are looking to gain an edge. And as I mentioned, from a research standpoint, while we're going to go through some of the research, there's a lack of quality peer-reviewed research available in humans. And athlete doses have not been well studied. What I mean by that basically is that a lot of times athletes or people who are using these at much higher or much different sort of regimented doses that are not being studied in that manner. So it's hard to make claims based on study outcomes when athletes are not using them. Imagine using 4 times the dose of an antihypertensive in a 6-week cycle versus the standard dose on a daily day. You're going to get very different outcomes there. So just be aware that the research is limited, particularly in how a lot of these are being utilized. And we are not really clear about which groups are at risk, but in general, I would have thought that men are more likely than women to utilize substance. I don't know if that's just my own bias, but I feel like I see a lot of quote unquote gym rats who pop through and they're all on a ton of things. And I don't feel like that's the case. But if you look at the data, actually women are more likely, I think 52 or 53% of women compared to 48% of men are more likely to be on a supplement as a general population. So don't allow your own biases to color that as something to kind of factor in, but there's more data research needed to evaluate different subsets of our population. As I've sort of alluded to, supplements may be thought of in some instances as ergogenic aids. As you know, athletic culture, if Lance Armstrong, Mark McGuire, Roger Clemens or Barry Bonds or Marion Jones or any representative, there's a culture of selective advantage, and how can I push the limit here to the absolute edge and try to gain a benefit over my peers. I thought Lance Armstrong made a very interesting quote during his interview with Oprah, saying that, quote, I didn't do anything that anybody else didn't have access to, more or less implying that he did it better than everybody else. And he said that it was more or less broadly available to everybody. And when asked if he could have feasibly won the Tour de France 7 times or as many times as he wanted, not using substances, given the culture of substance use in professional cycling, he said that would be impossible. So certain sports like cycling, there are substantial issues there. Baseball has been another sport that's been in the critical focus of steroid and supplement use for selected advantage. So just be aware that our athletes, some of the guys we see in our training rooms, are not going to be willing to talk about things further. They may be inadvertently or however role models for others. So just be careful about that, and just be aware that what people are reading out there, oftentimes anecdotal evidence compared to peer-reviewed literature, which is limited in this field. People are going to take your opinion as one of many opinions. I'm just going to admit Mike into the forum here. Hi, Mike. We're in the process of talking. Just wanted to welcome you. There's about 10 of us on the talk right now. So with that in mind, I wanted to pause and see if there were any questions or comments so far. Give people a chance to share their thoughts or comments, or maybe even their experiences, just because there are a number of us on this call today. I don't know if I think.
Well, one of my experiences, you were talking about seeing the men who walk in with the muscle building supplements, but you also have to keep in mind that the thermogenics, or the weight loss supplements, where there's very high doses of like ephedra or caffeine are heavily used, and that a lot of those are used in the women of the population too. So that's what I've seen a lot of.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's been really challenging. Anybody else have any comments? I can certainly share an anecdote from my own experience as well that I think will be valuable, particularly to our younger members here.
One thing I like to do, sorry, this is JP talking from OHSU. Sometimes, probably less so with athletes, but just sort of like my general family medicine population in general. Usually like asking them what they're hoping to get out of using whatever the supplement is. Because
Yeah,
oftentimes I feel like there are other things that they could be using that have more evidence, or have fewer side effects, and really discussing all the possible alternatives to using whatever their supplement is.
yep.
Since we know, again, so little about what's in them and how effective they are.
Absolutely. I think that that's a really, really good point, is to try to explore those practice habits and understand the underlying reasoning there. I think that's wise to say that so early in your career, JP. So great comments. I think one comment I would have just to add to the mix is that I've had a number of patients come and ask me, hey, well, you're the doctor who takes care of quote unquote this team. Oftentimes it's my collegiate or professional teams. You must know about steroid use. You must know about these things, because don't your athletes take them? And it's kind of an interesting question. And I'm like, one, if they did, they're probably not telling me about it. And if I do break through and I'm able to have a conversation about it, I would want to be able to actually have a reasonable conversation and a rational conversation with them. I will say that oftentimes it is a challenge to have conversations about these substances, because a lot of times the person in the room who you're taking care of will feel or may know more about that substance than you are aware of. And so it's okay to say, hey, I'm just not aware of it, but I'll look it up and see what evidence I can find through the channels that I typically look at. To see what evidence is out there. I tell people I'm kind of a filter for you, is like, hey, I have this knowledge that I've trained many years to obtain. That doesn't mean I'm an expert in everything, but it does mean that I have the tools to be able to take a look at some data and try to sort it out and understand whether this would be beneficial or not for you in different ways. So I think having those conversations, you start to gain a comfort level with that. And I try to leverage other issues. Like if I see somebody on a ton of supplements and they have abnormalities in their LFTs, or they have hypertension, or other features that might suggest that they're taking something that might be harming them, then I think there's a little bit more leverage there as well. So trying to build that trust, build it over time, and to be able to speak the language, all of those things are, I think, important in terms of having these discussions in meaningful ways if you're interested in having those discussions. So yeah. Any other comments? Otherwise, I will move on to talking about what ergogenic is. It's another talk.
Just in my experience too, is that supplement questions are very important, especially if you have any issues with rhabdomyolysis. I've seen where these kids will go from being on the couch, they'll order something on the internet like Jacked. I don't know if you've ever seen that.
Yep, Jack 3D.
Oh yeah. And they go from the couch to doing like P90X. And then they'll come in, and I've seen upper extremity, almost compartment syndrome even with it, and sent several to the hospital with college kids with rhabdo because of them. And they don't mention them, even though they're taking 2 or 3 or 4 of they'll be taking a thermogenic and a muscle builder, and leads to, hospitalization because of rhabdomyolysis.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's absolutely a concern, especially when you have those kind of scary or bad outcomes. One other piece of advice, Roy, you may actually have experience with this too, is being in the locker room, trying to keep your ears open to things. It's amazing what I hear. So I had a guy with the Seahawks, and this kind of stays in this room, but I'm not going to tell you who it was, but it was one of our players a few years ago who came in during the preseason. We were having this culture of a lot of guys coming in for IV fluids. And I always try to argue with our athletes that IV fluids really pose more risks than benefit, and there's probably not a whole lot of evidence at all to support their use, but it's a cultural thing, and oftentimes people are asking to just during the training room, lie down for a few minutes and kind of peace and quiet. But anyways, this guy who'd never come in his career for an IV, he'd been with our team for a couple years at that point, comes in, and I was like, hey, I've never seen you come in for an IV before. What's up with that? He's like, oh, I got over my needle phobia. I'm like, oh yeah? Tell me more. And he started spilling his beans about how he'd been training at a facility outside of our state during the off season, and that in this particular location, there were a number of providers who provided services to athletes and others for recovery. That could be somebody who was at a casino gambling and had drank too heavily. And he said, yeah, there was a bunch of drunk people there and a bunch of athletes, and we were all getting our IVs. And it was called the drip room. And I was like, oh my gosh. And so, there's this, so the next time I was having a conversation, some other time, I was talking to one of the guys, and I was going to do his IV. This is a couple years later. And I see that it looked like she had an IV in the past couple of days. It looked like a fresh, like he had a fresh mark from a previous IV. I was like, looks like he just got an IV. And he looks at me, and before he's able to say anything, I was like, dude, I know all you guys and your, Myers solution and all these other things. And, in the drip rooms that you guys go to. And he looks at me, and he was a 10-year vet, and he starts laughing kind of uncomfortably. He's like, you know all that stuff? I'm like, dude, I know all that stuff. You don't ask about it, but I know it, and I know you guys are all doing it. And that didn't lead to a conversation right away. But then, a week later, he comes back and he's like, hey, Doc, I gotta ask you something. And he pulls me in the room, and he's like, what do you think about Myers solution? And, we start this conversation, and it was sort of me kind of cracking open the door. So just being aware of what conversations are happening around you, and you might learn more than you would imagine. So just keep that in mind with any of these substances, be it performance enhancing drugs or supplements. I think it's just something to be aware of. So that's similar for you, Roy, in terms of kind of picking up on things in the locker rooms and things like that.
You hear everything in the locker room, and a lot of it's big talk, but when you see them gathering around and talking about things, I mean, these guys are always trying to find out something new, something different that's ahead of the game, looking at things that are more metabolites rather than an overt, androgen supplement or something like that. And they all talk about it, and they all discuss it. So, yeah, I mean, you'll hear conversations, you'll hear people talking big, and a lot of it you take with a grain of salt, but I mean, you do learn a lot, and you learn it pretty quick, especially if you're in a professional locker room. But yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah, definitely interesting time. So, well, just in the interest of everybody's time, I'm going to kind of continue to plow through here, talk about a few of these supplements just to provide some information about them. Just talking about ergogenics. So ergogenics, anything designed to enhance performance, and that could be pharmacologic, physiologic, psychological, mechanical, or nutritional. So just be aware of different ergogenic aids, and they're not just pills necessarily. And our focus, at least the best I can do, will be to focus a little bit more on legal ergogenics, or things that people can take that are not banned by the NCAA or the governing bodies of various sports organizations. I'm going to focus a little bit on caffeine, creatine. I dropped ribose from this talk because it's not that popular anymore. Some of the alkalizing agents, and bovine colostrum, also known as muscle milk. So just being aware of some of those. So muscle milk, at least a lot of the formulations used to have bovine colostrum in it. So being aware of that, I think, is something to be factored in. If we had more time, obviously, maybe we can choose other times to talk. Banned substances such as amphetamines, growth hormone, steroids, are considered ergogenic. There's other supplements that we could talk about that are not considered ergogenic, although there's debates about vitamin D and its role in recovery, fish oil and zinc, and then there's a variety of other substances that all are worth considering if you come across them. And there's many more than these, obviously. So caffeine, 1,3-trimethylxanthine is the most commonly consumed drug in the world. And actually, I don't know if my video's on, but I got some caffeine right here. And functions typically as a CNS stimulant. Obviously, you guys know that. I chart a lot faster when I have my coffee on board, and for others it may be other things, but it has multiple effects on metabolism, as well as skeletal and cardiac contractility. And so almost 100% of what you take is absorbed. So for those of you who are heavy caffeine consumers, just know that most of it is actually getting in through the gates. Actions throughout the body appear to correlate reasonably well with plasma caffeine levels. It's got a half-life of between 3 and 10 hours, depending on your particular constitution. And prior to 2004, it was actually on the World Anti-Doping Association's restricted list of ergogenic aids if it were at a certain level. And it actually is considered a banned stimulant if when tested it reaches levels above a certain threshold. So just be aware, and then that would take a lot of caffeine to get to 15 micrograms per mil in the urine. But you can imagine if somebody's popping a bunch of 5-hour energies, that could have some effect on their performance and may show up in their urine. So how does it work? Caffeine blocks cellular adenosine receptors and increases neurotransmitter release as a result of that blockade. It actually increases the ATP pump activity, increases catecholamine concentration as a result of that, and immobilizes intracellular calcium. So in the above manners, by increasing calcium, catecholamine, and ATP use through the ATP pump, it improves skeletal muscle contractility and cardiac muscle contractility. It also decreases glycogenolysis through free fatty acid metabolism. And as you know, it facilitates CNS activation as well through separate mechanisms. So it has some impact on both muscular function, both cardiac and otherwise, CNS function, and glycogenolysis. So multiple studies demonstrate a positive impact for caffeine on endurance. So there's a study from 2010 that running time to exhaustion and heat was prolonged in individuals with caffeine intake at a certain level. And endurance cycle time performance and trial performance may be impacted by caffeine intake. And there's several studies that demonstrate positive impact on total work produced in sprint activities that is maintained over repeat testing in the interval where the caffeine is still bioavailable to those athletes being tested. So just be aware of that. It has a performance benefit. There's a number of different studies. If you look at sort of meta-analyses comparing caffeine ingestion before and during exercise to placebo. So there's some variability depending on the study population utilized as to whether there's truly efficacy or not, and depending on where you draw your line as to what's effective or where placebo provides its effectiveness, which is where that bar is. And so you could see that there's some debate about how effective caffeine actually is depending on who and how it has been studied. So caffeine's adverse effects, while it's generally considered safe, it can have some heart rate and blood pressure impacts, can lead to insomnia, obviously headaches, both from use and withdrawal, tremors, anxiety, and withdrawals, almost like any stimulant, can have some impact in that manner. So in general, caffeine appears to improve intermittent sprint performance and endurance performance. It also seems to be variably influenced by the timing of intake, I should say, injection, but their intake, and then how often it's ingested. And one thing that I didn't mention, but it seems that taking doses more than 6 milligrams per kilogram doesn't really impact performance any more than taking a dose less than that, if that makes any sense. So don't go over 6 milligrams per kilogram if you're trying to use it as a performance enhancer. So creatine is the other popular one that's been around forever that people continue to use to this day. It's a naturally occurring non-essential guanidine obtained in the diet via fresh fish and typically meat. It's actually synthesized in the lab from glycine, arginine, and methionine, but it can also be produced in the body through the liver, kidney, and pancreas. It's excreted as either creatine or creatinine. And so one reason I often will be checking creatinine levels in my athletes, and oftentimes their numbers during the off season are higher than their levels during the season, because they're doing a number of different supplements in the off season to try to improve their health and performance, and they can come in with abnormal levels. So we, especially with any of my athletes with renal compromise or concerns regarding renal compromise, like, hey, they have an elevated creatinine to start with, I tell them that for the couple weeks before we get the test, why don't you lay off your creatine so we can get a real picture for how your kidneys are functioning. There's no clear indication, though, that the extra creatine in people with normal kidneys can cause any deterioration in kidney function. So factor that in. So proposed effects for creatine are increasing muscle mass, increasing maximum power in high intensity repetitive work. So you can imagine things like CrossFit, football, where you're doing high intensity, almost anaerobic burst activities, increasing speed, are all thought to be proposed effects of creatine. So as I mentioned, the majority of creatine stores in the body are typically as phosphocreatine stored in muscle, typically skeletal muscle. And phosphate is reserved for ATP synthesis. So you might imagine that if you have a greater pool of substances available to generate ATP from, there may be some benefit from that to performance of that muscle, which is absorbed that extra store. Higher percentages of creatine are stored in faster twitch muscles, so just factor that in as well. And so here's just a diagram of different sort of energy sources as you move from anaerobic or burst activities to aerobic exercise, and creatine increases ATP availability as well as its own availability as a resource for exercise. So it has that impact in early phases of exercise based off of this, this particular diagram. At least it appears that way. How does it work? Single and multiple sprints dramatically reduce muscle creatine levels. So you can imagine we're depleting this energy store rapidly because there's not much of it around. And so if you increase your stores via supplementation, you may improve performance through reduced ATP degradation and the capacity to resynthesize ATP early. So having that creatine around basically bursts your stores of the stuff you use upfront for exercise. So just factor that in. And increased creatine levels may reduce your body's reliance on anaerobic glycolysis. So it provides you more resources to avoid things like glycolysis. And it also may positively impact glycogen storage to provide more energy for other types of activities as you transition towards aerobic exercise. So typically creatine is used by starting with a loading dose of 0.3 grams per kilograms per day. So about 20 grams a day for a week. And that can increase intracellular creatine levels in skeletal muscle by about 25%. And then the maintenance phase for most people is to use 3 to 5 grams per day, which is thought to be adequate due to the body breaking down some of that, plus insensible and excretional losses, saying, okay, if you're trying to maintain a higher level of homeostasis, doing 3 to 5 grams per day is thought to be about the right amount to allow you to do that and gain some benefit from it. Though there's some concerns that effects may diminish after you've been using them regularly for about 2 months. So some people will go on cycles where they'll use it for a few months and then come off of it and go back on it. So creatine is an ergogenic aid. As I mentioned, there's a number of different studies that showed in short burst exercises, I meant 20-second sprints, there's been have been shown to be benefited from creatine, and especially when recovery time is limited, so you have short recovery time. In those particular situations, performance is not enhanced as much as when you provided longer recovery times, and that's been shown in a number of different studies as well. So here's evidence of sort of looking at phosphocreatine resynthesis rates in repeated sprint performances following short-term creatine supplementation, and you're seeing the differences there in performance changes with creatine versus placebo, the dark boxes being creatine, the white boxes being placebo. The graph on the right shows changes in performance from baseline in people using placebo versus creatine. You can see some benefits there, as well as exercise time and sort of duration of impact. So just factoring that in. So essentially, it seems that creatine is effective in improving performance in short bursts of high intensity exercise, such as sprinting and weightlifting. You can imagine it may have more impact in those rapid activities, like if you're a football lineman trying to drive a block, something like that. Doesn't appear to have so much benefit for people who are involved in endurance sports, though there are some studies that show some small, statistically, though unclear, sort of clinically significant outcomes there. So side effects, generally considered safe, although there's anecdotal reports of dehydration, muscle strains, rhabdo, kidney damage, compartment syndromes could be an impact, you can imagine, and long-term effects due to creatine use on an ongoing basis have not really been studied. I showed a picture of Popeye there because people like that effect of creatine because it seems that they get swole, that's sort of a comment. It's like, oh yeah, I feel like I'm all pumped up with this stuff because their muscles are also have absorbed more fluid that follows creatine intake as well. So just be aware of that. Alkalizing agents, so anything that helps theoretically neutralize whatever acidity is quote unquote building up in your blood, have been something that's been controversial in sports because they have more side effects. So sodium bicarbonate and sodium citrate are the primary options used in athletics. And the idea is that, in theory, this should be used to counteract the effects of lactic acidosis in exercise, although there's a lot of controversy around what lactic acidosis actually might be. There's thought that alkalizing agents may buffer this acidity environment that happens during exercise and may improve muscle performance and cellular performance during those time frames. So proposed action: intense exercise results in the production of hydrogen ions in the muscle. And those hydrogen ions are therefore released into the bloodstream. And if you have more bicarbonate available to you, and it's available extracellularly, it may help buffer that increase in hydrogen ion concentration. So it also thought that increases in acidity, if you don't have that buffer there, can lead to muscle fatigue and reduced performance. And that essentially adding alkalizing agents act as essentially a reservoir for neutralizing that extra hydrogen ion production. So there are studies that show that there's impact on performance to taking about 0.3 kilograms, 0.3 milligrams per kilogram body weight. That increases your bicarb production by about 5 millimoles per liter if you were to measure that. Most people would recommend taking bicarb about 60 to 90 minutes prior to exercise. But the problem is it kind of can give you stomach upsets. The way I tell my athletes is, you know, you might take this stuff, it may help you, but if you feel like you have to have the shits afterwards, that may work against you. So there's this balance here of like, well, gosh, I want better muscle performance, but if your stomach is upset the whole time you've done this because you've taken enough bicarb to have a meaningful outcome, if you can't tolerate it and its GI side effects, that may be a problem for you. So studies of bicarb and buffering agents have shown improvements in power and performance for high intensity exercise. So 10 cycle, once again, those high intensity cyclical sprints with 50-second rest intervals, there are some benefits there. And power output has been shown to be improved as well for endurance exercise when bicarbonate is used. So maybe for both short and long-term benefit. Here's some of the graphic representations of using sodium chloride as a comparator versus sodium bicarbonate and outcomes based on sprint number. And you can see that people who are taking the bicarb seem to perform better than essentially the sodium chloride, which would be your comparator. So seems that in limited data, bicarb appears to be useful as an ergogenic aid in exercises of short-ish duration, 1 to 7 minutes. There's a lot less data around longer exercise duration, whether it has any benefit for exercise periods longer than 7 minutes. I mentioned stomach upset, bloating, diarrhea, vomiting, and many athletes feel like, hey, if I take it at the doses I'm supposed to take it at, I can't tolerate it. And so, and bicarb supplements, you know, it's basically baking soda, so it's not as profitable and so harder to find because it doesn't generate as much money. So bovine colostrum, I think this is my last supplement to talk about, marketed as a supplement for improving athletic performance, GI disorders, mood and depression. So a wide variety of purported benefits, improved fat-free mass, quite popular, at least back in 2012. I think muscle milk is still fairly popular, although I'm not sure the versions with bovine colostrum are quite as popular as the ones that are not. Bovine colostrum has a number of different constituents, as you might imagine any colostrum might have. Immunoglobulins, growth factors, cytokines, oligosaccharides, immune regulators. So somebody looked at the constitution of colostrum as something that would benefit a newborn and said, well, what about if we take that and turn it into something for performance? It's sort of the idea. And it's, as I mentioned, the initial mammary secretion following delivery with all of these different substances that are thought to be bioactive and beneficial, but very limited in quality of research and product design. We don't really know how it works, although we do know that colostrum is important to early development. It's thought that dietary colostrum has been shown to increase insulin-like growth factor 1 concentrations, and insulin-like growth factor is part of the growth hormone cascade. It's the mechanism by which growth hormone has a lot of its impacts upon cellular metabolism and function. And so just being aware that there's a possibility that it works through that mechanism indirectly through the growth hormone cascade. Typical supplementation routine is 60 grams per day for 8 to 9 weeks. And studies of similar methodology have shown quite a bit of variability in results. There's one study of 51 athletes showing some benefit to performance in peak vertical jump and peak cyclic power in those individuals with alternative resistance and plyometric training performed 6 days a week. So maybe some benefit there, but you can imagine there's potentially a lot of confounders in these studies. There's other studies that show that doses of between 20 and 60 grams per day for 8 weeks seem to have some improvement on VO2 max in prolonged rides. So some studies that show some benefit in both endurance output as well as in high intensity training. So being aware that there are some studies, but they're limited in quality. Other studies on the other side of the spectrum show no improvements in rowing performance in elite female rowers in a randomized double-blinded placebo-controlled trial. Also, peak running speed in 30 active male runners in a double-blind randomized study really showed no benefit, essentially equivalence between groups. A variety of different studies that I've put out here. So there was quite a bit of studies here. So ultimately, just to conclude, since I think I've taken up almost 45 minutes, a little over 45 minutes of our time, is that similarly designed study outcomes provide different results. So you would wonder about product variability, study group quality, data showing exercise improvement and performance are available but limited, and research suggests that there's maybe some benefit there, but it's unclear. So commonly packaged ways to see some of these supplements, as I mentioned, caffeine, typically 5-hour energy or Metabolife. Creatine monohydrate is a very popular supplement even to this day. I talked about muscle milk being the kind of most popular version of bovine colostrum, although like I say, I'd have to double check and see how many of those products now actually have bovine colostrum, and baking soda for bicarbonate. Alternatives to supplementation, you might think, hey, how else could I advise my patient to handle their overall benefit? Is a balanced diet and a rational exercise plan, sort of what you think would make sense. Appropriate rest and recovery. Most of our athletes are overtrained and they're looking for routes around their fatigue. And oftentimes if they can just give themselves some rest, that may be as beneficial as anything else we've talked about. And trying to set appropriate goals, the obvious things to try to help them. So are these ergogenic substances or not? So it does appear that caffeine, creatine, and bicarbonate have some evidence to support their roles as ergogenic aids, but evidence does not support bovine colostrum. I didn't talk about ribose, but that's another one that's limited. And if you guys are looking for more information, here are a number of different resources. The NIH has the National Institute of Drug Abuse. The National Centers for Drug-Free Sports has a resource. World Anti-Doping Association and IOC have resources, as do all of the other institutions there, including the FDA. So if you're looking for information, these are good places that are vetted to provide that information from a more traditional viewpoint. So appreciate you guys all being here. The only other thing I would like is maybe some comments and feedback about how this method works, since this is really me pioneering this. I mean, we've all done distance learning before, but we've never done it across programs or across fellowships the way we're doing it now due to the circumstances. So if any of you guys have comments, I would really appreciate that, or even just suggestions as I sort of think about this moving forward, or so people like Roy and I and others are trying to figure out how to do this better during this time where we just don't have as much hands-on. So I'd love to get your opinions.
So, I mean, I sat in on this to see how it would work. And honestly, I think this is a great idea to include basically fellows across the nation. I would like to be able to help you out and be involved with it, as far as providing lecture material or even giving lectures, because, I tell our residents who are interested in fellowships and all that kind of stuff, don't do your electives here, do your electives somewhere else, see what else is out there, different approaches, different teaching styles, different experiences. And I think that this is a great way that no matter what fellowship you go into, you're going to be able to get some different experiences that way. So, sitting in on this, I'm actually thrilled that this is available now, and I'm going to have my fellow kind of be included in this too. I forwarded the email to him yesterday that you had sent out. and however we can help, I think, I don't know how I'd be able to upload PowerPoints and be able to discuss them, or if I have to send them to you and then you load them and then run them that way, and how we access these